All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time is for you. Welcome to another exciting, informative webinar, co-sponsored by IFES, GDC, and IUCE. This is Krishna Vidula from IUCE from India, and thank you for joining us. We have with us an outstanding speaker. I mean, it's just amazing we get all these excellent speakers for these series, and thanks to Hans, he brings them from all over the world. We have with us today Dr. J.P. Auffret, who is the director for the Center for Assurance Research and Engineering in Volgenau School of Engineering. He's the director of research partnerships in the School of Business at George Mason University. He's also co-founder and current president of the International Academy of CIO, CIO standing for Chief Information Officer. Okay. Auffret's work and research span a range of applied technologies fields, including CIO and ICT governance, cybersecurity, leadership, and innovation and application of emerging technologies, and with APEC, APEC, NSF, National Science Foundation, and the US Department of State, World Bank, ITU, and IBM. His experience includes executive positions with MCI and his joint venture with British Telecom, Concert, and academic positions with George Mason, Duke University's Center for International Development, and as physicist-in-residence at American University. Dr. Auffret earned a BS from Duke University, where he has an AB, and Duke Scholar, M.B.A. from University of Virginia, and Ph.D. from physics, in physics from American University. So thank you so much, Dr. Auffret, for taking the time to spend with us today. With that, I'll just leave it up to you.
Thank you, Krishna. Many thanks to Hans. You all have a wonderful speaker series and are able to get some really interesting talks every week. I think it's fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Our topic is going to be artificial intelligence and COVID-19. Kind of three topic areas. One is a little bit of background on the evolution of artificial intelligence over the last 50 or so years. But then the main focus is on innovations in artificial intelligence in medicine, and then how artificial intelligence was applied to COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the successes and some of the challenges that researchers in medical profession and policymakers faced. So today, artificial intelligence is making major inroads in medicine. This is from several years ago in Korea with the IBM Watson system with the application of artificial intelligence to oncology. So tremendous promise for oncology with artificial intelligence, both in the diagnosis and the recommendations for treatment. That the oncology is a field where there's moving rapidly towards personalized medicine, tailoring treatments because of someone's genomic makeup, and also where there's great innovation and great research from around the world. So bringing all these things together, on the face of it, a tremendous application for artificial intelligence. But we'll see as the talk progresses that even with remains some challenges. Many of you work in the field, but I think it's interesting to remember some of the early expert systems in the late 60s and 70s, some of them from Stanford University. Two of the better known ones were Dendral and Mycin. These were expert systems, one for analyzing the mass spectra, and the second for bacterial infections and possible treatments. The idea of these is that the computer scientists would sit with the doctor or the expert and actually ascertain what type of if-then questions or series of questions a doctor asks when they see a patient or when someone analyzes a spectrum, and then to actually codify that in a computer, and then the computer would go through the same iteration, the same set of steps, the same path to try to make a diagnosis or to make a conclusion as to what compound was present in a sample. So really much different than the way some of the artificial intelligence is done today. Landmark, what was here, this is the former world chess champion, Garry Kasparov. This is 1997, playing the IBM computer Deep Blue. This was the first time that a computer beat a world champion in a chess match. But the system, while with much more advanced computers and sophisticated programming, the idea of it was really quite similar to those early expert systems. That the human chess expert, the way the programs worked is that the very capable computer looks into the future with alternative moves, alternative half moves in the future, looking 6, 7, 8 moves ahead, and at each endpoint evaluates the chess position. And so where the human expertise was involved was how to program this evaluation of the chess position. In early chess playing programs, that evaluation function wasn't very good, and the computers would make moves that were really something that not very good and that a human wouldn't make. But by this time, 1997, the evaluation function was much better. The power of the processes was much greater, and the computer actually able to beat the human. But again, somewhat like an expert system and much different than today. IBM wanted to apply this AI expertise to something that can benefit society, chess being a fascinating but relatively narrow pursuit. And they applied it to the game show Jeopardy, where you have to ask a question that matches with an answer. So it's really questions and answers. And IBM's idea was that computers are connected to the internet more and more at that time, able to access information from around the world and from publicly available and also non-publicly available databases such as libraries and closed journals, and then act on all of that information with their artificial intelligence to really answer questions or contribute, for example, in healthcare. So the computer did very, very well at this game too. And IBM's view was doing well at a game like this, including with the natural language processing, would enable the computer to really make a contribution in medicine and other fields. So this artificial intelligence is a little bit different than the expert system, bringing together information from many sources and being able to recognize with natural language processing what a question is. Recently, though, artificial intelligence has had a somewhat different path, still with expert systems, but now more and more with machine learning, either machine learning with an assist called supervised learning from a human, or on their own, what's called unsupervised learning. But this is a really fascinating example. It's a Google chess playing program called AlphaZero, which is now the strongest player in the world, stronger than all the computers and stronger than all the humans too. And the way this computer became good at chess was through adversarial learning. All Google did was provide the computer with the rules of chess, and the computer played itself over and over again, millions of times, and through that became very, very, very good. So good, and also quite interesting is that this AlphaZero doesn't play like a computer, like the previous computers or the other ones that are very good today. And it doesn't really play like a human. It has somewhat of a hybrid style. But again, through this adversarial learning, playing against itself, getting tremendously good. And it's a way that the artificial intelligence has moved over the last several years. And it's also where you see a lot of the innovation in artificial intelligence. So you can imagine in the cybersecurity world is actually occurring using this approach for adversarial learning with the attacker and defender. So cybersecurity practitioners themselves using this sort of approach, but hackers too, using it to ascertain weaknesses in networks and systems. And then potentially the future, there's quite a debate as to how far off this might be, or indeed whether this will actually occur. but artificial general intelligence, and you see this quite a bit in movies, some of which are quite famous. Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger, WALL-E and Blade Runner, and some very, very good movies, but older, so Metropolis from the 1920s. So this is what everyone thinks of when they think of an android or artificial intelligence that moves about with humans and is relatively autonomous. Many considerations or challenges with artificial intelligence, as we'll see. This is a graphic from Deloitte on trustworthy artificial intelligence. Many governments looking into considerations for trustworthy AI, both from the standpoint of the science, but also from regulation. NIST here in the US has a trustworthy AI program, but many around the world. And you can see some of the elements. So fair and impartial. As an example of this, Google had a program that they were using a little bit for to assist in hiring employees. And so they had a data set that they used, a baseline data set of their current staff. And then they started to apply the machine learning or the AI to hiring new employees. And what they found was that it wasn't fair or impartial because the existing data set of current Google employees was heavily male-oriented. And so the system was prone to pick males or select males. There's a research effort going on with some African universities with the point of view that the are available are heavily developed country oriented and not appropriate or applicable to the African context. So the underlying data that's used is very, very important. So of course, robust and reliable, transparent. European Union, part of their privacy regulations, have that the AI needs to be explainable to someone. And so that's a big part of AI in Europe and also around the world. So for example, if an autonomous vehicle had an accident and part of the accident made a choice, being able to explain that very important for certainly a police investigation, any sort of insurance or lawsuits. Responsible and accountable and safe and secure and private. So what's happening with AI in healthcare? As I mentioned, tremendous application across medicine, quite a bit in oncology, and many of the major oncology journals have AI articles in most months now. So for the diagnosis and for the recommended treatments, and to some degree, although this is very difficult, that the path, trying to predict the path or progression of disease. As an example of the challenge of that, not from oncology, but for following on to the great success with hepatitis C and hepatitis C treatment. A lot of research now is on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And it's very difficult to ascertain the progression of that from an inflammation to fibrosis and then to liver cancer. So being better would assist physicians in identifying paths of treatment. Prostate cancer too, most prostate cancers are quite benign and progress very, very slowly over many years. And so if a physician was able to forecast that progression with some certainty, they might make a different recommendation for treatment. So for example, if a patient was 75 or 80 years old and had the forecast or prognosis for a very slow progressing disease, then the treatment might be quite minimal compared to a much more invasive treatment for a more aggressive outlook for progression. These are quite fascinating too, that there's a change in data from, especially on clinical trials or starting in clinical trials. this is the Apple Watch. There are others. And so able to monitor heart rate, many other things too, oxygen levels. And the Apple Watch has been, in quite a few cases, has identified people with heart disease and high risk of cardiac arrest, oftentimes quite young, and not, they had a heart defect or needed a care. I actually know 3 people who didn't realize they had a heart issue, but it was flagged by an Apple Watch. For clinical trials, what's fascinating is traditionally clinical trials, they enrolled patients, and then the patients would be part of the trial in receiving a treatment for their illness, and they would go to the trial leader or to the hospital once a week or once every several weeks for a blood test and to be evaluated. Now, and so it was a snapshot picture, but highly accurate. Now with these medical devices, such as the Apple Watch, the data is 7 by 24. So it may not be as full, as accurate as going to the hospital, but there's more data available. And so the question is, to what extent can something like an Apple Watch gather the data for a clinically valid trial? And the US Food and Drug Administration has okayed several trials like this, for example, with through Stanford and Duke University. I find this to be a really fascinating example. It goes back to the adversarial learning, but it also relates to one of the challenges of artificial intelligence and machine learning is having a baseline data set. So oftentimes that there isn't a baseline data set or a baseline data set of sufficient size to be valid or to provide a statistically valid result, or a data set that's representative. This is a University of Toronto study, and where there didn't have sufficient numbers of lung images. And similar to the AlphaZero with chess and similar to the adversarial learning for cybersecurity, what University of Toronto researchers did was they set up an adversarial situation where the AI would develop a fake image, a fake lung image, and then a second AI would try to whether or not it was real. And so it's an adversarial situation, and over time, the became really good, and the researchers were able to augment their data set with the ones. So I think kind of a fascinating example, but relevant to other situations too. The real test with medicine is integrating technology into the workflow of a hospital or a clinic, or for cases of chronic illness such as diabetes, into the workflow for the patient, where the patient visits a clinic, but also is being cared, has things to do at home and with his family in regarding to care. So operating ICU operating room, but to what extent can the AI be integrated right into the workflow to make a real contribution? The other thing I think that's can gather from this picture, but in other ways too, is that the progression of AI in the future will be, in many cases, AI and humans working together. So how can the two together be better than either the human alone or the computer alone? So I think see this a little bit with the cybersecurity, where the computer does many of the events that come through daily, millions of events in a large organization. And those that it cannot make a judgment on, a human analyst will look at. But I think you see it too in call centers, where the humans more and more second and third level support, and sometimes the automated attendant, the first level. On the question of data, many countries trying to augment their data sets. National Institute of Health in the US has this program to gather the data for 1 million patients, volunteers, contributing the data, which will then be de-identified and available to researchers and with machine learning. Also, too, competitions. This is based on the old Star Trek television series. I think there still might be Star Trek today, a newer version, but and also the movies where the doctor would wave a device over a patient and be able to make a medical diagnosis relatively quickly. So Qualcomm organized a contest to try to foster innovation towards the development of one of these tricorder type devices. And while no one won the competition, several of the teams came quite close. And so a wonderful way to drive innovation. I think within the next several years, there will be these types of devices. And in fact, the FDA just approved a remote device like that. Not as capable as one of these, but that you could wave it over someone and at least gather some information. Another example of these contests is how research in autonomous vehicles was catalyzed by DARPA in the US. And so 2004 and 5, the view was while there was much research on the systems that go into an autonomous vehicle, the research wasn't progressing fast enough to make a military-grade vehicle that can travel 50 miles an hour over mountain terrain. So the vehicles at the time were able to go 5 or 10 miles an hour. And so DARPA created this contest, a grand challenge. The first year, the contests were run through the Mojave Desert on 100-mile courses. The first year, no team made it more than 8 miles, but this DARPA considered it a success because so many more researchers came into the field. But the second year, 4 or 5 teams completed the course. And many of the researchers from those contests are now active at the companies doing autonomous vehicles, but also universities. And this is actually also, I think, the wave of the future too. This is another DARPA project. The idea of it is that the mobile phone, the smartphone, can uniquely identify a person, but that the smartphone also gathers so much information, even without adding supplemental sensors, for example, heart rate and oxygen levels, that a smartphone can make early diagnosis for many illnesses, but including for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and MS. So it's this bringing all this data together and then trying to draw a conclusion. And in fact, there was a small study using this newer technology in England for monitoring symptoms from COVID vaccines. So here you can see the personal behavior characteristics all picked up by the smartphone, how a person uses the phone, facial recognition, eye movement, the many sensors that are possible on smartphones, how someone is using it, and then mapping it to disease biomarkers. So of course, this needs a very large data set to start to train the AI and then test it and validate it, but a real promise for the future, but combining AI with this capability of the phone and the availability of data. So how is AI used for COVID? I'm going to talk through some examples and some of the challenges. I think this was interesting. This was an editorial in Lancet from a month or two ago. I think it was an interesting title. Is that the results were mixed. That there are a lot of efforts and applications with AI, some successes, including on therapeutic and vaccine development, but also some challenges in that some of the work wasn't that rigorous, which in a way isn't surprising because it was very short time spans and trying to rush things into the marketplace or for application. But we'll see some of those. But I think this is true in many areas with AI. A lot of successes, sometimes in more narrowly applied fields, but also to some of the challenges from Deloitte. But here we'll see there's actual scientific challenges that have been a part of the COVID response. This is an interesting article, and this points to the rigor of some of the models, and both in the science and the algorithms, but also in the relevance and the applicability and the size of the underlying data set. So this is in a 300 radiology or imaging models for diagnosis. These researchers found that 0 of those were suitable for clinical use, that the data sets weren't representative, the results weren't necessarily valid or replicable. Two of the main concerns from them. But I think kind of interesting, I think too, much of the COVID research was fantastic, but also quite a lot too was published so early that the results may not have been that valid. Part of the challenge, I think, for public policy is that some of the research was being used for and so there was this great uncertainty through the many months. This is also an interesting paper. There's other taxonomies of how AI is used in medicine. But I think this is a good summary. Early detection and diagnosis, monitoring treatments, contact tracing. Some countries did quite well with this. Projection of cases and mortality. This is the point I was making on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and prostate cancer. Here too in COVID, being able to predict whose illness was going to progress from the beginning symptoms of fever and perhaps a slight cough to more major symptoms and needing to be hospitalized. Developments of drugs and vaccines, reducing the workload and prevention. So a good range. One that's not on here that has been very important recently is supply chain for vaccines. So AI has been very helpful with that, and also for PPE, which Taiwan has used. So prediction models. Two types. A main type, and where actually applied somewhat, is predicting the early progression, but also better making a prediction of whether someone has the illness or not when they go to the emergency room. So being able to do that quickly, or having another way to do that quickly, can be really helpful, especially when hospitals when they were quite crowded with patients, and that's true in some areas still, but much less. So these prediction type models, both for the individual patient, but also prediction type models for populations. Here, I think the results were quite varied. Early on in the pandemic, it was early in the curve, and it was really quite hard to project whether for AI or for human. And small changes in assumptions could lead to very large differences in the forecast. But still, I think there was such a reliance on the models that increased rigor or perhaps learning from other fields could have been helpful. As an example, I grew up in Miami in South Florida, which is in a hurricane area or hurricane zone. And so the U.S. Hurricane Center, but others around the world, they utilize computer models, and they have 6 or 7, the National Hurricane Center. And when they publish a hurricane map for the public, they have the projected paths from each of the 7 models. And you can actually see the uncertainty. And I think in a lot of the literature and certainly the newspapers, there was a reliance early on 1 or 2 models, which may or may not, in some cases, turn out not to be reflect what the actual path was. This is Oxford University, and this was a really neat project to be able to, at the emergency room entrance, make a better diagnosis, have a better feel for whether someone would have that has the illness prior to actually doing a test, a viral test. So they had quite good success with this, but some of the commentary and critique is, to what extent is the Oxford University Hospital patient population representative to the area region overall in England, but that region, Oxford Cotswold region, but also to what extent is it representative of the UK population overall. So again, this question of the data set and applicability. Also, too, another example, non-COVID, for clinical trials by definition have a limited number of patients. Even the phase 3 trials for the final step of a drug or a medical device approval, many times the number of patients is smallish and not fully representative of the population, or perhaps not very many from different genotypes or ethnic groups, or even male, female. And so part of the post-surveillance monitoring is to go from the small sample to where you have hundreds of thousands or more actually using a medical device or taking a drug and being able to ascertain to what degree the sample is representative or not, or to what degree the pharmaceutical actually does have side effects that need to be monitored. This is actually quite neat. This is from NEC in Japan, so a technology and IT company, but moving into, they do have a advanced cancer platform, and utilizing IT and artificial intelligence, going from their advanced cancer research to trying to assess vaccine candidates for COVID-19. And they had some quite good success of it. So that they had 2 filters. They had the genome filters of people, but also filters on where on the virus, what connecting points really mutated, so that when a vaccine was developed, the chance of a mutation of the virus where the vaccine wouldn't be effective would be low. And then a different type of application that I referenced was contact tracing, or this connection of government systems to the health system. So this is Taiwan. Taiwan very early on, early January of last year, connected their customs and border systems to their healthcare systems. And they were able to do that. They've had 20 to 25 years of investment in digital government. And because of that, they were able to flag people coming back to Taiwan from China, and then flag when those residents and citizens then went to a clinic or a hospital with COVID or COVID-like symptoms. So this contributed to their success in combating COVID. They never really shut down Taiwan, and so they've had a balance between healthcare and their economy. One other neat thing, well, they did many neat things. One other that I'd like to highlight is Taiwan has a very large number of 7-Elevens across the country. And the national government has partnered with 7-Elevens for many years now to put citizen kiosks within the 7-Eleven. And so that the citizens are able to access digital services. And so this is good for the citizen. It's good for the government, but it's also good for the 7-Eleven because it draws in customers. And so for COVID, the residents or citizens were able to go into the 7-Eleven, put in an order for PPE, for masks and gloves, and then several days later, the government would have the delivery there for them. So they're able to utilize their existing system with the government kiosk in a 7-Eleven to distribute the PPE. So going back to the Deloitte graphic, that there's been successes, but also European Union and others have identified some of the challenges of artificial intelligence in COVID. And it's the ones that we were talking about earlier. It's the privacy considerations, the representative data sets, the robustness and validity of the models. To what extent are the models transparent and explainable? So I think one of the outcomes of COVID and the application of AI is that the regulation of AI or a regulatory framework, including this transparency and explainability, I think will be a little bit earlier than it would have if COVID hadn't occurred. One other example on privacy and AI, it's also a European Union project. It's through Barcelona. It's in Barcelona and Amsterdam. And it follows on, Google had a project in Toronto called K-Side, and it was a smart city project, and they were going to redevelop part of the waterfront. And it was going to be highly technology oriented, with most everything in the area being monitored, like cameras, traffic lights, water use, electrical use. And the Toronto government set up a privacy commission for the project. And it turned out to be quite controversial. The privacy commission, several of the privacy commission members quit very publicly with letters to the newspapers saying that in their view, Google and the project wasn't oriented towards privacy, that there weren't the guarantees in place, that the resident data wasn't going to be sold on to third parties, and that there wasn't the oversight of subcontracts. And so following on to that, the European Union project has the idea of it a citizen commons, where the data from the smart city applications are actually by the citizens of the municipality or the city, and that the citizens and the city government establish the guidelines on subcontracts and the guidelines on the vendors. So I think that's an interesting project, and I think many cities around the world looking to projects like that for smart cities, but also to artificial intelligence, as to who actually owns and manages the data, and how is someone's privacy going to be guaranteed. So a couple summary points. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think artificial intelligence has made great roads in medicine and healthcare and continues to do so. And many journal articles every month promise it goes across many fields and across many aspects of medicine, all the way from drug and pharmaceutical development, medical device development, but to treatment and diagnosis. but many challenges too on the Deloitte parts. But also to leave you all with one last example of a challenge. So medical devices more and more include software. And so the drug regulators or medical device regulators around the world, if a medical device, a new medical device from a new vendor is similar to a previous medical device, the approvals are streamlined. They don't need to go through the full range of clinical trials. But with software, this is very, very difficult to say that something is exactly similar as something else. It's also very difficult because software has versions and versioning and releases. And part of the difficulty comes with how the medical device operates. So for example, a pacemaker with the software, but also the cybersecurity risk of the device. So some of the regulators, including the US Food and Drug Administration, are trialing this approach where they're okaying the software developer for good software developer practices as part of the medical device approval. And so knowing that the software developer has these good practices in place, then the regulator has a better feel that the software is probably developed well and is trustworthy. So I think it's a fascinating field. I think AI in medicine, tremendous progress that's both from a company and academic standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint is going to affect everyone's life. And so I think it's an area of a great interest for research and society. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you for a very, very fascinating presentation. So, we have time for a few comments, questions from our August audience here. So let's hear it, folks. Just wait for a few minutes as they start warming up. If in the meantime, Hans wants to welcome you, I'm going to unmute you, Hans. Want to say anything? You can unmute yourself now. I've unmuted you. Come in, Hans. Or maybe not. He's probably not in a position to do that. Questions, comments, anybody? Just write in the chat box. So while we're waiting, what's happening in the education space in terms of teaching artificial intelligence? Obviously, it's applicable in so many different fields. So teaching artificial intelligence to all, not just computer scientists, is that something that's happening around the world that you're seeing that students in the freshman year are being taught artificial intelligence so that they grow up in a world of that sort?
I haven't seen that. I think I think it's being taught in the MIS curriculums, sometimes through machine learning in our courses.
Yeah.
Also, obviously, in computer science and across engineering and in physics and chemistry, I think a little bit less so in other areas. It raises a very good point, though, with artificial intelligence being more and more integral as part of software and IT. There's an awareness issue, both for students, but also, for example, for local governments and national governments as to how they're going to apply it and to what the baseline knowledge is needed to apply it well or safely.
Okay, let's see. Devdas, any comments, questions from you? Devdas, we got Hans, I unmuted you. Any comments from you? Kyle Milligan is here. Hi, Kyle. How are you? Just any comments, questions from you? We got M.D. Matthew. We got Samuel Mukasa. Our regulars are all here. So any comments, questions? Tushar Nath. Let's just get some, get those chat box working. Any of your students? We've quite a few students here too. Slow evening. There we go. Some people are getting warmed up a little bit. Question from Aliki herself says, how will societies respond to artificial intelligence? Okay, and what may become the conceivable uselessness of workers?
There's been some interesting studies. I think there's a study by Asian Development Bank 2 years ago on developing Asia. And the question, there was two questions. One was, two focus. One was what roles or what part of a job role could be replaced by artificial intelligence and robotics. Second question was economically, would it? And they looked country by country, and countries where so for example, in some of the textile industries, conceptually artificial intelligence can replace many of the jobs, but where the incomes or the wages were low, the risk of that was actually low. And so it'll vary by country, and then it'll also vary by job role. There's also some studies that, for example, in accounting, there's many aspects to an accounting job. And so taking accounting, dividing it up into tasks, and of those tasks, ascertaining which are applicable or where AI might be possible, and then which would the human continue to do, and then how would the AI and human continue to work together. There's also a major issue demographically. Countries with aging societies, such as Japan and Korea, Taiwan, China, some of the European countries, US to some extent. So there the AI is going to augment the initial existing workforce and help to maintain productivity, but countries that are much younger, some of the African countries, over the growing population, such as India, projected to grow, increased population for many years still. So there it's a very different consideration because there's a younger workforce who need jobs. And so the dynamic is much different for in India compared to a Japan or a Korea or China.
So there's a prediction that workforce in 10, 15 years, the type of jobs that'll be out there are going to be quite, you can't even think of what those jobs are. They'll be quite different from what they are today, right? And so as educators, if we have to plan for the future, what's your recommendation?
As you say, it's very difficult to know what 10 or 15 years will be like. Just as 20 years ago, before the internet and really before the smartphone, it would be difficult to predict today. And so for educators, it's how to foster a love of lifetime learning in the students, so that someone stays current through their career, is involved in some of the newer things, and so that they're able to shift as their industry shifts. I mean, not just industries can change quite quickly too, but companies can change also, and so staying current can be really helpful.
So you would say the buzzword, the critical word would be lifelong learning. People should learn how to learn, teach students how to learn, right? Continuously learn.
I think so, and a love of learning.
Yeah.
Someone we work with here who does a networking class, they say there's 3 ways someone can introduce themselves. That there's I am, such as I'm a professor at George Mason, or I am working on, so someone's working on, for example, artificial intelligence and medicine, and then I am thinking about, be like the privacy challenges of artificial intelligence, but a way of connecting with people and staying current outside existing role.
Okay, we got Devdas Shetty from Washington, D.C. One of our faculty, Dr. Ola Duni, is investigating the use of artificial intelligence and exploring how COVID is impacting African American community in different way. His results are fascinating. He says, that's great. Then we got MD Matthew saying, assuming that artificial intelligence is much superior to human intelligence, can I assume that in the future intelligent people will be required less? Samuel Mukasa, as artificial intelligence becomes better and better, are we going to reach a point when computers learn to program themselves, thereby making coding as a profession redundant? I want to address any of those
Interesting
comments.
points.
Okay, we have probably come to a point where we can say thank you and goodbye. Anybody else have any quick comments? Hans, are you able to get in? I mean, I've tried to unmute you. You might want to say your customary closing remarks if you want to, but I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself. You're on a mobile, maybe you're having difficulty with the technology, so I'll do it on your behalf. So, Dr. Auffret, thank you so much for a very, very enlightening presentation. It's so futuristic that people are a little bit in state of shock and didn't have too many questions, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Krishna.
Thank you very much, Dr. J.P. Auffret, and there'll be a recording of this available. So anybody wants a recording, please just contact us and we will have it sent out to you. And everybody have a great day. Be safe, be happy, and there is yeah, that's great. So and be healthy. All right, take care, everybody. Good morning,
Thank you.
good evening,
Bye.
good night. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.